Hi guys, welcome back to the next episode of the TRA Performance Education Podcast with me, your Tiny Titan host, Vicky Mirceta. I will never change. I am always here, so if you don't like me, tough. But my guests, on the other hand, they do change. And today I'm really excited because I have got a fantastic guest, Danny Lennon from the Sigma Nutrition. Now, everybody should know who Danny Lennon is, and if they don't, then shame on you, really, because Danny runs the most epic Sigma Nutrition podcast as well that I have been listening to for time. So anyway, enough about me blabbering, Danny. Tell everybody who you are, what your background is, and why they should be listening to Sigma, realistically.
Sure. So I'll try and keep it fairly concise so we can get into some good stuff. But I suppose the main things that people might care about, my own background, got into nutrition really as I suppose most of us do, mainly concerned with my own performance, both in various different sports that I used to play and in the gym. And I went to college originally studying biology and physics. And so obviously during that time started learning how to read peer-reviewed research, and really as a hobby outside of that ended up kind of going and trying to learn what things could I help myself with my own performance, my own athletic goals. And so kind of looked at stuff in like sports science and psychology, and obviously then nutrition was one field that popped up. And it was just grabbed me, and I really became fascinated with everything I could about nutrition, far beyond even exercise performance, going into health and so on. And so after graduating, went back and did a master's in nutritional science eventually, and started doing some coaching, consulting, and then eventually from there ended founding Sigma Nutrition, which is a company that I'd probably describe as a educational media company that tries to put out information on evidence-based nutrition. And so we do coaching, but we also are primarily known for a lot of the content that we produce. And as you mentioned, Sigma Nutrition Radio, which is a podcast I've had for about over 4 years now, I guess, that's been going. And so that's kind of a rundown of some of the basics. And I suppose kind of relevant to what we're going to discuss today, a lot of my own work as a coach has kind of been working with athletes that are in weight class based sports, a lot of that being boxing and MMA, and helping them not only fuel training and recovery, but also make weight and then perform on the night of competition. And that kind of extends to other areas like Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting and so on, as well as the various others. But that's been one area that's been a particular of interest to me, given my own interest in combat sports, and I've done some jiu-jitsu and MMA and so on in the past. And so it just became an area that I kind of fell into, and has been that's where a lot of the information is kind of lay, I suppose.
Fantastic. Okay. Now, one of the things that we are going to be discussing today is a hot topic at the moment, because obviously there are lots and lots of competitions going on. There's powerlifting, there's MMA, there's bodybuilding. And one of the big major concerns that everybody wants to do is obviously make weight. Now, there's lots and lots of different ways on how people can make weight, but let's kind of get into the nitty of it. So how do you actually look, if we take a powerlifter, for example, because I find those really fascinating personally, how would you actually advise somebody to make weight in the safest way possible? And then we can go into other drastic measures.
Sure. So the first thing I tend to try and point out to people is there's kind of two distinct phases that we tend to talk to athletes, for example, in this case, a powerlifter, about. One would be the kind of a chronic term, or over the longer term, managing your body composition to change your body weight. And then the second would be what most people tend to think of as weight cutting, is in those final few days before your weigh-in, what things can you do to acutely drop your body weight? And that is kind of very separate from actually losing any body fat or changing muscle mass, for example. So the first is kind of getting a time frame that's long enough for the athlete of saying, okay, if we have a powerlifter, for example, that is quite a few kilos away from their weight class, and we've, say, a few months before the meet, we look at kind of, okay, what level of body fat are we at? Is it possible that we can diet that athlete down very gradually so they can maintain performance in the gym, but at the same time bring down some body fat, which will of course lose some body weight. And really the idea is to get them within striking distance of being able to make weight in those final few days without any drastic measures. And so the way we've tended to do it with athletes is work back from a maximum point they should be about a week out from the weigh-in. Okay. And so this will and we can go through some different examples because, for example, with powerlifting, if they compete in an IPF affiliate where they have a 2-hour weigh-in, it will be a different number that we should aim for versus if they're in a different federation with a 24-hour weigh-in, just because of how much weight they're going to be able to cut and get back on before they compete without any negative consequences. So if we think of like a 2-hour weigh-in, and let's say, depending on the person, it could be anywhere between 2 to 4% is a fairly doable weight cut for that person in those kind of final few days. So we'd have that they want to be within that range of their weight class, and then how many weeks we're out from that point will dictate on, do we need to diet down now, or are you okay where you're currently at? And so that's the first thing I tend to point out. Those two distinct phases of dieting and losing body fat is a different phase compared to weight cutting, which most people tend to look at. Water, changes in water weight, glycogen, and so on. And we can get into some of the details there, I guess, if you want. But that's a kind of overarching structure that I tend to talk with athletes. And in terms of how much weight they should cut, there's a whole host of factors that I'm happy to talk about as well, depending on what area you want to get into.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm exactly the same. When I tend to program my powerlifters to lose weight, I like to actually lose the fat off them. But one of those things that you've really got to be careful of is obviously dropping weight too quick. So then they tend to lose strength, especially as they're going up through that peaking phase over the first kind of 6 weeks. So right. If you're talking about getting them to a point by changing their body composition, do you do the exact same thing as I'm thinking that I do as well, and just literally gradually bring them down so they're a safe weight, maybe a week before they actually weigh in?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a few steps back we could take, because there's no kind of one right answer to this. Right. And as you'll see from various different weight classes and different lifters who've been successful of all different varying amounts of body fat. And it's not necessarily always that you'll be more successful by going down a weight class, which I think is a big misconception with a lot of powerlifters. They think, okay, if I'm lifting this at this current body weight, if I just went down a weight class and was hitting these numbers, I'd be way more competitive. Yeah. As you know, that dieting process and just losing mass in general is going to have an impact on not only your training and recovery, but also then on the day as well. Even in some cases, if they lose a dramatic amount of body fat, it can change things like your leverages. So one thing is to not necessarily think that it's the lower weight class is always better. So what I would think is the first point is for an athlete to think, okay, what is my ideal weight class? And so if they are kind of in between two weight classes, this is where it becomes a bit more tricky. Should you go up or should you go down? I think for people in the early stage of lifting, typically it tends to be better just to go up a weight class, try and focus on building muscle over the kind of coming years. And in the long term, you're likely to be more competitive. I think that the best way I've heard it is Greg Nuckols often talks about really your best weight class is going to be the highest weight class you can get into without becoming excessively fat. So if you can get into a higher weight class and build more muscle, then sure, fill it out instead of restricting yourself. Now, let's say we have a lifter who is typically walks around at like 76, 77 kilos. That would be typically something that I've done in the past, competing at 74. That's fairly close, or at least within striking distance of making 74, but it's still quite a way away from the body composition of some of the people lifting at 83. So if someone like that is going to lose weight, then sure, I think what we would try and do is how can we start first leaning you out, losing body fat without affecting strength, which is kind of your original question. And the kind of primary way we're going to do that is, one, like you say, try and make that gradual. So give the athlete enough time to diet, ideally probably quite a bit away from competition. I think if you're trying to do it in those final 3 to 4 weeks where the intensity is going up quite high, you've got other stresses that are going to come into play around competition, I think it's probably not going to be as productive. If you do it well away from competition, there's probably not that, there's not typically for most programming styles, there's not going to be the same level of intensity. It's typically going to be higher volume, which may again help hold on to more lean mass as you're dieting. And so give yourself plenty of time, make it a nice, slow, sustainable rate of body fat drop, monitor your progress in the gym, and see if the actual weight loss is leading to changes in strength or not. And probably in the kind of longer term, over many months, if someone is going to be dieting or trying to make a new weight class, they probably want to not only take into account the lifts that they're actually hitting in the gym, but probably look on that on a relative to body weight. So what is their Wilks score, for example, if they're a powerlifter, or what's their Sinclair score if they're a weightlifter, to see if if this change in weight class is actually productive or not. So I've kind of rambled quite a bit there, but I think the kind of general idea is, that slow, sustainable, get into a place where you're a bit leaner, particularly if the athlete has a lot of extra body fat. If they're already very lean, that may not be doable. And you may have to just consider how much you can actually cut in that kind of final week, as opposed to doing so.
All right. Okay, cool. So now we've got to the point where we are a week out. The competition is on Saturday, and on Monday you are weighing 3 kilos too heavier. So now it's that holy shit moment. What do I do now? Because we can't just gradually bring them back down, can we?
Right.
So what would we have to do at this point then? I'll let you explain it, and then I'll ask you questions and things like that. What would you then do at this point?
Sure. So in an ideal scenario, we would have worked out, say, well in advance, okay, how much of a weight cut is actually doable for this athlete. And that will scale on a few things. One is obviously just body weight. So someone competing in the 120 kilo class can obviously cut a lot more weight than someone competing in like the female 47 kilo class. So we'd go more on a percentage of their body weight. So I think, like I said, for most people, if they've never kind of cut weight before, somewhere between 2 to 4% of your body weight drop is probably as much as I would be happy for someone to do with a 2-hour weigh-in window. If it's 24 hours, we can talk about much bigger, but for that 2-hour weigh-in, probably somewhere between 2 to 4%. Now, where exactly for any one individual that they'll feel best and be able to still perform will be variable from one to another. The other is, if someone's just starting new into powerlifting and they're doing like their first meet or so, I just wouldn't bother at all, right? Just get some meet experience. It's not going to be worth trying to cut weight and the extra stress. It's mainly if cutting weight to get into a new weight class is going to make that person competitive, then they're going to specifically go and try and win a meet, for example. Okay. So if they're within that 2 to 4% range, then like you say, we're not really looking at changes in body fat over that final week. So instead, there's a number of things we can do to acutely change your body weight on a scale that have nothing to do with actual change in tissue. Some have more of a detrimental impact on your performance than others. So the first place I would start would be the ones that are not going to have any real performance detriment. So the first one that's probably really underutilized by a lot of lifters is the use of a low residue diet or a low fiber diet. And simply by removing high fiber foods from the athlete's diet for about 2 to 3 days before the weigh-in, you can lose, depending on the athlete and what their habitual fiber intake is, this is typically comes in anywhere between half a kilo and a kilo of body weight. Wow. By simply just removing that for, say, 3 days to a very low fiber intake or a low residue intake. Because all you're doing there is losing bulk that's typically staying in the intestine, and now that's no longer there. So again, depending on the person's size, what weight they are, what their usual fiber intake is, if they're quite big and usually have a lot of fiber in their diet, it can be as high as a kilo, in some cases, potentially even more. So that one will have no detriment on performance because you're just losing residue from the intestine. So that should be a go-to for everyone. Beyond that,
just before you carry on that one, just because I've got a question going on in my head at that point.
Absolutely.
If you take the fiber away and you're saying that it actually reduces the residue that's actually in your gut, in your resting bowel there, is that not going to actually impact on bowel movements, which could obviously impact the scale weight as well?
Right. So this is where kind of a synergy of all these different strategies is going to come in. Okay. And it's going to be timing of this is important as well. So like you say, if that's a long-term thing, that's very problematic, not only for health, but for things like bowel movement. So what we're going to try and do is time that for, like I say, the last 2, maybe 3 days where you're going to pull down on fiber intake. Ideally, or not ideally, but in a lot of cases when the athlete is trying to make weight, we're probably going to be reducing their overall food volume as well anyway. Sure. And a lot of athletes are probably going to be reducing overall their normal amount of food. So the losses you're going to get from that loss of residue, within reason, probably shouldn't cause, or at least I haven't seen it cause major issues for just a change of 2 to 3 days for most people. And if the athlete is particularly worried, then like maybe you could think about some like very mild, gentle laxatives 2 days out from the weigh-in, but I would certainly have that trialed for the athlete if they wish. So again, typically it doesn't seem to be as big of a problem just within that time frame. So with that, we can see a considerable drop. On top of that, then other things we could look at here is a decrease in carbohydrate intake in that final week.
Yeah.
Essentially here, we're just trying to lose some of the glycogen stores within the muscle, primarily. If they get really depleted, probably the liver too, but primarily muscle losses of glycogen. And with all the glycogen, so the stored carbohydrate we have in our muscle, there's also a certain amount of water that gets associated with that as well. So we're losing both glycogen and water weight from muscle over that kind of final week, just by simply restricting carbohydrates to a low intake. Now, there's kind of a couple of things to note here. With powerlifting, a decrease in glycogen levels probably isn't going to be as problematic for performance as, say, if we were working with a boxer and an MMA fighter. For those people, if they deplete glycogen before they go and compete, we would need to completely refill those stores. It's probably not as urgent for a powerlifter. And so even if they lower glycogen levels after they weigh in, we can probably get some carbohydrates into them. That's still going to be able to be perfectly fine for their competition. So they can lose some weight simply by decreasing their carb intake to pretty low levels in that kind of final week or so. And considering that most athletes, not all, but most will typically taper off their training in that final week, it won't really impact performance either in training, because training loads are typically going to be lower, or volume is going to be lower in that final week too. So with that kind of combination of things, the next kind of thing that layer in would be what most people tend to think about is changes in water.
Yeah.
So we can change the amount of water the body is holding in a few different ways. One is obviously through just water restriction. So dehydrating the athlete by restricting water. One thing that we know from research that came out of Australia last year is that you can actually enhance this effect by doing a period of water loading before you actually restrict. And this has been a method that I'm sure many people listening have probably tried before. It's been going around for many, many years in various different sports, but only up to last year we had some real good research on it out of the Australian Institute of Sport. They looked at some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes and going through a period of 3 days of water loading. So this would be so I think the amounts used would be something like 100 mils per kilogram of body weight. So say for an 80 kilo athlete, something around 8 liters per day for 3 days in a row. And then the day before your weigh-in, you would restrict that water intake down to something like maybe 1 liter or 3/4 of a liter. So quite a low intake after that loading period. And then you tend to get a bit more water loss from the restriction. So that's just one way. Restrict your water, you get dehydrated, lose some water weight. Obviously, other ways to lose water from your body is to actually induce sweating. So this would be where people have done like light exercise or use saunas and so on. Typically for a 2-hour weigh-in, it's probably not the best idea, just because if you're relying on huge amounts of dehydration, you're just not going to be able to rehydrate properly in that time frame. You're probably going to be able to rehydrate at about maybe 1 liter per hour roughly. So if you keep that in mind, with lots of dehydration, you can probably get rehydrated fairly decently for a 24-hour weigh-in. With a 2-hour weigh-in, your window's obviously a lot smaller, and we know dehydrated athletes are going to perform worse. So even if it's something like powerlifting, where people will say, well, how much does it really matter? They're doing one lift at a time. It's just 9 single reps over the course of the day. Obviously, the dehydration probably doesn't play directly as much a role as it would for a boxer or an MMA fighter, again. But we know quite clearly with things that go on at the cellular kind of level, how important hydration is for even like muscle contraction and so on. So we don't want someone super dehydrated and cramping up in the warm-up room. It's just going to be poor for performance. However, if the athlete has already got within a fairly close mark through dieting over those number of weeks, then did a low residue diet in combination with a lower carb intake over the final 7 days, they should be already pretty close to making weight. And then just a water load and water restriction should get the vast majority of athletes there. And so for ones that are really pushing the boat out and cutting even more weight, then some light induced sweating could probably be used, although not ideal. But if the athlete is going to do that, it should be for very small amounts of weight, in my opinion, for someone, let's say, lifting with a 2-hour weigh-in. Someone with 24-hour weigh-in, it's quite different. You can get away with a bit more. But that's generally the kind of variation in different strategies that we can talk about. You may play around with things like, say, some salt restriction on the final day or two. That's probably not as much research behind, but probably worth doing. And then you can also look at things like stopping, say, creatine supplementation a week to 10 days out may have a role. So there are a few of the things, and when you combine them, it should be, like I say, that 2 to 4% body weight drop should be pretty doable. And then the emphasis switches to, okay, what do I do once I weigh in to make sure I'm okay to go and actually lift?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's switch over to that then. So obviously for the 24-hour weigh-ins, it's not so bad. Like you said, they've got time to rehydrate and get some more carbs in their system and that kind of thing, especially if they have kind of used bits and bobs of all of the strategies that you talked about. But what happens with the 2-hour one? So say a powerlifter weighs in at 7 a.m., makes weight, but then their first lift is at 9 a.m. They've got 2 hours to kind of replenish everything. Yeah, I mean, let's just stay with the powerlifting, because obviously I think that's quite a nice one, especially because of the fact that they only have to do 9 lifts as well, realistically. So would you actually advise them then to just kind of throw down a litre of water straight away and then just get some carbohydrates into them at the same time?
Yeah, so again, depending on how much they've restricted will probably depend on the urgency. So if one of them has just cut something like 1 kilo or less, super easy, there's probably not too much fuss. We'll get them drinking and having some food that they know they tolerate pretty well. For those that have kind of cut more weight, it becomes more of an issue. Ideally, as soon as they step off the scale, get some fluid and some carbohydrate and electrolytes into them. So something fairly straightforward and easy for them to get access to would be like to use a sports drink. Lucozade Sport, Powerade, something like that. It's going to have that combination, or of course they can make their own if they wish. So that's going to give them a combination of those kind of 3 things that are going to be useful. Within that, then after they've immediately taken something there, like I said, there's probably going to be a cap on how much you can rehydrate. So if they just start drinking and just knock back 3 liters of water all in one go, it's probably not going to be a good idea. They're probably going to feel pretty nauseous from that. They're going to end up urinating most of it out, so they're not going to be actually retaining it. So somewhere around thinking about another liter per hour for the next couple of hours. And that's why it's probably important to make sure that the weight cut isn't too drastic and they haven't dehydrated too much, so that they can focus on getting an adequate amount of water back, but they haven't dehydrated by so many kilos that they can never make it back. Then obviously if they're having a meal, probably focus on having some carbohydrate in there. But another kind of thing to consider, particularly because, like I said, the carbohydrate demands aren't quite as important here as they would be for even amateur boxing, where you compete on the same day. Because of that, probably sticking to a meal that they know they digest pretty well, that are typically used to having, something they would probably usually have a couple of hours before they go and train, is probably going to be very useful. Whereas one mistake you often see with lifters is they'll weigh in and then they start having all these like glucose gels or various different sugar combinations. Right. Yeah, and huge doses. I'm thinking I need to get in as much sugar as I can, but it just causes GI distress. And so that upset gastrointestinal tract is going to be more of a problem during the weigh-in and try to compete and so on. So I would stick to meals that they're used to, make sure they're getting rehydrated at a suitable rate. That can include things like electrolytes if they wish, maybe even some creatine or so on. And then once they've got a sufficient amount of kind of calories, trying to make probably a good idea to get some decent amount of carbohydrate in there from those. And then it would kind of switch more to kind of what short-term supplementation it would take on the day. But that's general kind of framework for kind of a 2-hour weigh-in.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And you've managed to fill the whole half hour just by that general synopsis of what you've done, which is brilliant. So now I understand that you do have a book, obviously, which obviously I have a copy of, and I enjoy reading thoroughly, and I do actually think that I want to read it again now that you've gone over all of those things. But we don't want to give too much away because, guys, I think you need to buy the book. So, Danny, where can people find that book from you?
Sure. So I would have been happy to talk about all of it, but as you can see, the small amount I was able to get into probably fills quite a bit of time, so I can go quite a bit on. So like you say, yeah, the book is up on the website. It's the Sigma weight cutting system for MMA and boxing. It's just at sigmanutrition.com. You'll be able to find it easily there. The same kind of principles will apply to other weight making sports. Obviously, we've talked about powerlifting today. And so there's a few different sections of the book. The kind of first half is really about setting up the athlete's overall dieting principles just for maintaining performance, recovery, body composition, so on. So what should be their dietary approach in the long term? And then in the second, we talk about coming towards competition, how to make weight effectively, and really going into quite a lot of detail on some of the stuff that we discussed today, those different strategies, how you'd program it out, how you'd work out specific numbers for different types of athletes and different body weights. And the downloading includes a few spreadsheets that will do that for you. So you just enter in your athlete's numbers and it'll show you typical recommendations for, say, carbohydrates, salt, water, so on for those final 7 days. So yeah, it kind of just goes into a lot of this stuff in a lot of detail. And yeah, people seem to find it useful so far, and people have used it with various different athletes I've been working with to good success. And I just hope it's a useful resource for people, because it's the big kind of reason behind it was so many athletes undermine all the hard work and sacrifice they put in by just doing something silly with either their diet or their weight making strategy. And so trying to get rid of some of those myths and mistakes. And yeah, that's it. So yeah, sigmanutrition.com should be there.
Excellent. And what I'll do is I'll get all of the links off you when we finish off air here, and I'll make sure that they're all underneath the YouTube video in the comments, guys. So if you do have any questions for myself or Danny, then obviously please get in touch. And if you like the podcast, obviously give this one a like and share it around so that more people are going to stop all those stupid manipulations and actually do things properly and evidence-based. So that's it from myself and the TRA gang. So thank you again, Danny, for giving up your evening on this beautiful sunny bank holiday. I hope it's beautiful where you are as well, because the sun is shining here.
Yes.
And I'll catch up with you guys in the next episode. Thanks again.